And hello again from WJ Live, powered by the Western Journal. I'm Josh Manning, Deputy Managing Editor for Assignment here at the Western Journal. Joining me on the show today, Grant Atkinson. He is a writer for the Western Journal, reporter for the Western Journal.
That's right.
Writing reporter for the Western Journal,
Yeah.
and supervising reporter for the Western Journal, Michael Austin.
I supervise.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for being here, and happy President's Day to you all. We thought today would be fun to do a little bit of a departure, and instead of talking with you about news of the day specifically, we wanted to talk with you about influential presidents, specifically 3 different ones, and they are radically different. We're going to be talking about George Washington, the first president of the nation who set a number of precedents as president. We're also going to be talking about Calvin Coolidge, famous for being a president who actually was incredibly restrained and didn't do a whole lot of things, as is the want of modern presidents. And then we will be talking about potentially the worst president in human history. That would be Woodrow Wilson, the segregationist, eugenicist-ish, progressive, modern founder of the progressive movement. So let's kick it off. That's going to be the good one because that's what I'm talking about. But let's kick it off first off with George Washington, the father of our country. Michael, take it away.
Yes, good old George Washington. So when we were told to come up with presidents we wanted to talk about, I was reminded of a story we did last week on Quintez Brown, that 21-year-old kid that shot at the mayoral candidate in Louisville. So I did a really long report on Brown. I did a lot of background research on him, and he didn't come across to me like some thug or degenerate criminal. He was a really thoughtful and bright kid. He was he was running for city council. He was really active in the community. He was doing a lot of social justice stuff, but he seemed to really genuinely care about the people in his community. And he used to be a columnist for the Louisville Courier-Journal, which is a pretty big deal. So, I read through several of his columns in the Courier-Journal, and then I came across, as I'm reading some of these things, I'm like, wow, that's a really good point. That's really thoughtful. There's almost a full article where I was like, oh, we could have ran something like this, talking about, how different laws have impacted the black community and how that's had a huge effect today. Then, I'm reading this article. I'm loving everything he's saying. Everything is just so thoughtful and precise. Then all of a sudden, that thoughtfulness gets thrown out the window as soon as he talks about the founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. And then he says this line, or these few lines: my father grew up during the Reagan administration's war on drugs. My mother, my Nana, grew up during the Johnson administration's war on poverty. I grew up during the Bush administration's war on terror. War has existed in my family for generations. Are we a cursed people? Consider the answer our slave-owning founding fathers would give. Now that tells me, so this bright young kid who ends up, gets really triggered by racial justice stuff, and he gets super radical, then shoots up a Democratic campaign office because he thinks they're not progressive enough. He was indoctrinated into believing that this whole nation is corrupt from its core, that our slave-owning founding fathers. I've heard that phrase way too often, and it really betrays that these people have no idea what they're talking about.
It's the 1619 narrative.
It's 1619, CRT is embedded with these ideas. But if you use the phrase slave-owning founding fathers, and your intent is to say that they're these evil racist people that set up our country to kind of perpetuate slavery, you've never read anything that the founding fathers have written, said, or believed in, or supported when they were alive. And so, yeah, let's just talk about founding fathers. Let's talk about George Washington specifically, what he thought about slavery. So, Washington, Jefferson, all of these guys abhorred slavery. They thought it was, a moral blight on society. They wanted to abolish it. But, it's easy today from our little classrooms where they're teaching us how slavery's evil and everything's wrong. It's easy for us to go, okay, so slavery's bad. The answer is to abolish slavery. That's how it goes. It was not that simple back then.
As if you've got a wand.
There was a lot of complicating factors, and the founding fathers, all of them, most of them wanted to end slavery, but none of them wanted to do it immediately. And for, two main reasons. One of them was they feared that a race war would break out, and they considered, slavery to be an evil and race war to be an even bigger evil. And, eventually...
that would have been ethnic cleansing, too,
Well,
given
it
given the population breakdown.
And you saw a little bit of this, when slaves were released in Haiti, back before it was called Haiti. I don't remember what it was called, but there was this, big cleansing. And even when we had the Civil War, it was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Came to fruition. It's kind of what they predicted. For every 6 slaves that were free, 1 American died in that war. So, believe it or not, we actually did pay a pretty immense price in order to rid the country of that
literally in blood and treasure.
So they feared that. They thought we need to have a plan. We need to really stage out. We can't just release everyone into the population all at once. We need to set them up with skills so that they don't end up in generational poverty, which also ended up coming true. So the founding fathers, they tried to protect against all of these things, and nobody, a lot of people didn't listen to them. Really, they considered the pro-slavery people to be just as stupid as kind of the all-out 100% abolish slavery people, because neither of them actually wanted what's best for any of the slaves themselves.
Exactly. I think I told you about this. I had an argument with somebody in the newsroom. This might have been a year ago, where we were, and I don't remember if you were there or not. We were discussing slavery and abolition, and there's a book, I think it's titled Sick from Freedom or Sick of Freedom, something like that, but it's essentially about the cost imposed on slaves, the cost of the war that was imposed on slaves.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the war itself and the instant abolition of so many slaves resulted in, I want to say it was over 100,000 deaths. I think it was multiples of that.
Yeah.
And so I was asking a friend of mine in the newsroom, I said, so was that a good thing? Was it a good thing that we fought a war, 500,000-600,000 Americans died? Then after that, you have hundreds of thousands of slaves dying for the exact reason you said. They didn't have the skills that they needed, or the abilities that they needed to survive in a free free setting. And he said, "Oh, absolutely, it was the right thing. Yes, it was the right thing." And I just couldn't believe that. It's like, I'm not positive if selling hundreds of thousands of slaves down the river just so they can be emancipated today instead of over a length of time that would actually allow them to integrate into society would be a good thing.
Jefferson, described just haphazard emancipation as, quote, being more like abandonment than liberation for people whose habits have been formed in slavery. He considered the decision whether to free his own slaves as a measure between justice and self-preservation. If I just release, and a lot of people ask, okay, so they opposed slavery. So why did Washington? Why did Jefferson? Why did these guys own slaves? Well, unlike many slave owners of the day, the Washington and Jefferson, they were not making a profit off their slaves. They weren't exploiting them for work. Both of those men were actually losing money on their slaves. The reason they kept them was actually to ensure that those slaves enjoyed some semblance of freedom at a time when it was almost impossible for them to get it in any case. So there were no easy answers here. When Washington, when he finished his terms as president, he moved back to Virginia in the South from the North, and he actually left behind all of his slaves in the North. He kept financially providing for them, essentially making them free. So when you go back in history and you say, oh, well, George Washington was a slave owner, you have no idea what you're talking about. He was a slave owner because he was paying to ensure that they weren't exploited by another more, insidious slave owner, and to make sure that they were provided for when, if they were freed just instantly, they would have no way of making money, no way of providing for their families.
Well, those are the things that you're not allowed to talk about.
Yes.
If you own slaves, you're automatically bad. And I think even the conversation that you were having, saying, was it worth it for all these people to die? Could we have come up with a better plan to end slavery? I think anytime you say anything of that sort, you're automatically in today's world characterized as a racist. You just wish slavery still existed, and you can't have these critical conversations.
Which is so the chattering class should be stopping that. There should be an area of genuine intellectual inquiry
Yes.
about these things. But unfortunately, the academy's been taken over by the left, and so they've weaponized charges of slavery too. And I mean, what are the, it's super easy to say. In fact, I posted this on Facebook about the same time that I had that argument. I posted on Facebook asking if America, what should America have done earlier to get rid of slavery? Right. And the consistent refrain was outlaw it.
Okay.
And yeah, go for it. Go.
So
you can do it better than I can. Go.
So, when they were, penning the Constitution, if they had put a clause in there just banning slavery outright, Southern states would have become their own country. Yep. They would not have been part of the United States. We would have lost the Revolutionary War, probably. And
even if we had won, we wouldn't have invaded the South to stop slavery.
And Lincoln...
And slavery persisted in the North anyway.
The emancipation of the slaves, that would have come to the South, to where almost all of the slaves are, way later. It would not have happened as early as it did.
Yeah.
So that's happened.
Well, and we've got to recognize, just super quickly, we've got to recognize, everybody at this table agrees, all of you watching agree, that slavery was a horrible thing, and there were slaves that were treated absolutely horrifically. We have that documented. There were also people like Washington and Jefferson who took care of their slaves. And then the question begins to be, well, what happens when you've got slavers kidnapping people from Africa who are also sold by Africans into slavery, and they come to our shores to sell slaves? What do you do? Do you just allow the most brutal, horrific slave owners to buy slaves? Do you do that and ensure that their lives are hell? Yeah. Do you say, well, gosh, I'm not into slavery, I'm not going to support this? Then you end up with slaves just being shot because they're not of any use to anybody if nobody will buy them. So what is it's a horrible, horrible system. The point to this entire conversation is that there's no good outcome here.
Well, and
there's no good outcome.
Two last points on Washington.
But some things are better than others.
So one of the plans that, kind of what they came up with as a way for okay, how do we fix this, was to establish a colony in Africa to where they could send all the slaves back, and then they could have freedom there,
Liberia,
apart from all
early.
of this. And they sent a group of slaves there, and they all caught African diseases and were pretty much wiped out in a pretty bad way. They tried that, and then the last thing so a lot of people say this about George Washington, and people don't really understand the full scope of what this means. So on his deathbed, George Washington, in his will, freed all of his slaves, the slaves that he owned. So a lot of progressive historians view this as kind of, he's trying to make up for a lifetime of evil. Yeah. This is his last-ditch effort. It was so much more than that. He not only did he free them with his will, he used his entire he didn't have any children, so he used his entire wealth to basically provide for them. There were funds set aside for the health care for the elderly who couldn't take care of themselves, and there were funds set aside to teach the younger slaves how to read, how to write, and how to learn occupational skills. Yeah. So he had set up those slaves for a lifetime of success, and he took care of them with his fortune. For his whole life, he lost money taking care of those guys, and with his will, he used his money to take care of them again.
So, Michael, I can completely see leftists coming back and saying, "Oh, but he did own slaves. He did." So, Michael, what's the alternative to that? What was the alternative?
You could let them starve on their own, I guess.
But at least they wouldn't have been slaves.
You could let them work their hands, their knuckles down to the bone for some other slave owner, or you could do what George Washington did.
So I think one of the things that we just have to take away from this is that slavery was awful. It was terrible.
Yeah,
it's endemic to the human condition. It was everywhere. And there was no good way to deal with it. What we were trying to figure out was the least bad way to deal with it.
Yes.
And I'm not positive we came up with the least bad way to deal with it. In fact, I'm pretty sure we didn't.
Yeah.
But there were, but it was a hard thing to look back and say, oh, I understand everything went on. I understand the historical context. And yes, death be damned. Let's kill a couple 100,000 African slaves to free them. It's like, that's the best outcome we can come out with. Really? Okay. All right. Did you have a favorite quote from Washington?
Favorite quote? I don't know. We might have put it on the screen.
I know we had a quote. Did we put the quote on the screen?
Yeah, here we go.
Put the quote on the screen. There it is.
There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. A plan adopted.
Good. That's good. Now, I was reading. So, folks in the booth, we're just going to go long today. Sorry. Yeah, I was reading earlier today, and you read the Declaration. The Declaration doesn't make an exception based on race or sex. It says all men, and men isn't men, men's generic humanity, are created equal.
Yes.
But the original Constitution had trouble recognizing it. And I think what that is an acknowledgement that, hey, aspirationally, the American project is trying to get to the point where we are all equal and all treated equal. The Constitution, however, recognized it wasn't possible.
And what's
the alternative?
Yeah, we're going long today. So it's been documented, the intention of putting individual liberty, a lot of the clauses in there to promote individual liberty. The intention was for slavery to eventually be abolished. The founding documents were made with that in mind.
Yeah, why else do you put it in there? They're not so stupid as to be that hypocritical.
And that used to be agreed upon. Even people like Martin Luther King Jr., people who were activists in their time, agreed. Now activists today no longer agree with that, and that's why, in my opinion, there's a much wider divide because we can't even agree that the founding fathers had the right intention.
Well, and conservatives are essentially where Dr. King was. I mean, conservatives have been won over to that position. Of course, I'm not sure I would accept the premise that they were actually ever that far from that position, actual conservatives. But now, if you take Dr. King's thoughts and espouse them, you're a racist and a skinhead and a bigot. But anyway, all right. So there's GW. There's George Washington. Super long segment, but it was worth it. All right, let's throw it to Grant and let's talk about Calvin Coolidge.
Yes, I'm going to be talking about Calvin Coolidge, a president who many people probably do not think about when they think about who are some of the greatest presidents.
But he is important. I wanted to share this. So we were prepping for the show. We had to do some staffing changes for the show. Grant originally wasn't going to be on. We looked at having somebody else on. George was going to be on. Turns out all three of them ended up with Calvin Coolidge. I don't know how that happened. George said, I'm doing Calvin Coolidge. Abby said, well, if I do it, I'm doing Calvin Coolidge. And now here's Grant. Hey, I'm doing Calvin Coolidge. All right. Take it away with Coolidge. I won't interrupt anymore.
No problem. So this data that I'm going to provide for the background comes from the White House and from, I am reluctant to say, the University of Virginia Miller Center, but that's okay. They provide some good background information. So he took office on August 3rd, 1923, after Warren G. Harding had a heart attack. So he was promoted to president. And the way that he began his presidency was sort of the same way that he would conduct himself throughout the presidency, which is quietly. He was sworn in his own house by his father, who was a notary public, and he gave the oath of office in the middle of the night. He had his hand on the Bible, swore his oath to the United States, and then he went back to bed and slept until the morning, and then he woke back up. And that's kind of
my
how
kind of president, folks.
That's how he lived. That's how he conducted himself. The things that he is known for include, obviously, the Roaring '20s and the great economic times that he sort of, in some ways, inherited and also in other ways kind of furthered. But he's known for not holding that back, not having government checks that he wanted to put on these things. He had a very light hand when it came to regulating businesses. He kind of let the free market do its thing, and you can see the results of that. I mean, during the 1920s when he was president, he's in office from 23 until 1929, and that was some of the most prosperous times that we've had as a country. So you can see, those things, how well his policies worked. A quote from Walter Lippmann it sums up what his presidency was and how he kind of ruled the United States. And it says, quote, "This active inactivity suits the mood and certain of the needs of the country admirably. It suits all the business interests which want to be let alone, and it suits all those who have become convinced that government in this country has become dangerously complicated and top-heavy." And it's interesting to me because as I was researching Calvin Coolidge, a lot of the things that he did, especially the circumstances when he took over, were very similar in a lot of ways to the circumstances when President Joe Biden took over. Now, they're not exactly the same. I understand things were not as good when Joe Biden took over. We weren't in the middle of a huge, roaring 20s type of thing. However, when Coolidge took over, the influenza pandemic had ended recently, a few years before. It ended in 1920, and he took over in 1923. World War II had ended a few years before that, a couple years before that, in 1918. And Warren G. Harding was pretty much universally accepted as not a great president. So while these things happened, a little bit before, it wasn't like right before he became president that they happened. He was kind of the first guy who inherited a hope for this kind of good economy, because Warren G. Harding didn't really do much with it, to be honest. Yeah. Coolidge, he understood that this economy was ready to burst, was ready to have some of its best times, and so he kind of stood back and he said, "I'm going to let the free market do its thing." And that's interesting because it's the opposite of what we saw Joe Biden do.
That's a great comparison. Imagine if instead of cracking down even like more on COVID and regulations and lockdowns and all this stuff, if Biden had just, taken a letter out of Coolidge's notebook and just kind of stood back and let the economy recover, we'd probably be in an amazing spot right now. So,
but he's so unlike Coolidge.
Yeah.
Didn't Coolidge have almost nearly like a record number of words in his vocabulary? I think he was supposed to be one of the most literate presidents ever, I believe. And, Joe Biden seems to know roughly 250 words right now.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the extent of his vocabulary.
Soldier.
COVID, chump, corn pop.
Yeah.
Corn pop was a bad dude.
If you put those two words together,
Leg hair, sniff hair, girl's hair.
Yeah.
Come
on.
Man.
That's
Come on.
Yeah.
Pony. So what was the pony soldier?
Dog-faced pony
Dog-faced pony soldier.
Dog-faced pony soldier.
That's good. Are we done with Coolidge? We're still doing Coolidge?
We're still going. We're still on Coolidge.
Yeah.
So another similarity to Biden, while we're talking about Biden, is that kind of the idea of this time was that we needed a return to normalcy. We had this pandemic. We had this war that had just ended. And Harding kind of ran on that as well, and it didn't really work. People didn't like him. His administration was marred by scandals, and he's typically remembered as a pretty bad president who obviously passed away at the end of his term. But even before that, there was scandals. There were things that didn't look great for him. And so Coolidge didn't even really run on this return to normalcy sort of messaging, because obviously the first time he just was inaugurated after Harding died. So he didn't run a campaign. He kind of just lived it. Those were his actions. He was quiet. He was calculated. He held press conferences when he needed to. He was open with the press. He was known because he loved to have his picture taken, all these things. But he didn't say too much. He didn't go out there and just talk around in circles. He said what needed to be said, and then he kind of stepped back and, let the people rule themselves to a certain extent.
And that that leads to kind of the tragedy of Coolidge, which, he was a great leader, and like many great leaders, he's just forgotten about because he just didn't try to, plant his flag anywhere. He didn't try to make a name for himself. He did what he should have done, which is let the economy run, let the American people be free, and he didn't feel the need to grow his own power, which is usually, every president makes his name by, this is the big law that I'm helping push forward, or this is the big initiative I'm doing, when really the kind of presidents we need are the kinds that are probably going to be forgotten by history oftentimes.
There was one quote by a Democrat named Alfred E. Smith that I wanted to read because it rang so true based on what we've heard today and the messaging out there. He said, quote, "His great task," this is speaking about Coolidge, "was to restore the dignity and prestige of the presidency when it had reached the lowest ebb in our history, in a time of extravagance and waste. So I mean, it's just so similar to what Joe Biden was saying when he was running. I've got to bring back normal. I got to bring back a niceness to the presidency and respect and all these things. And he just didn't do it.
No.
Coolidge is a picture, I think, like you said earlier, of maybe how things could be or could have been, if we had a guy like that today. And that kind of leads me to the question that I wanted to ask you guys, I guess, which is, do you think there's any chance we ever have a guy like that ever again?
I don't think anytime, even remotely soon, because we're at the point now where we're so divided that essentially the fight isn't like whether to lessen government power or whether to grow it. The fight is who gets to take over the controlling interest.
Yeah,
and
where do you grow it,
and which half of the country is controlling that?
Yeah, without a radical sort of reimagining of the republic, I don't know how.
Yeah.
I don't know how that happens again.
Yeah.
Never say never, but yeah, I would doubt it. All right, so let's rewind then. We've done George Washington, we've done Calvin Coolidge. Let's rewind 2 presidents to the 28th president of the United States, and I think possibly the worst one ever. Though FDR and LBJ, they're competing for that title. Woodrow Wilson, Woody Woo, as a friend of mine in grad school said. That was at Princeton. They have the Woodrow Wilson School for International Affairs, and they apparently called it Woody Woo. A friend of mine went there. Anyway, they've now unnamed it. They've now removed Wilson's name from it because turns out the people at Princeton finally found out he was a wild racist.
That can't be true.
Quasi-eugenicist.
Progressives can't be racist.
Exactly. So we'll dig into that here. But first off, let's just lead this off with a quote from Wilson that everyone should know. And that is that the Declaration of Independence did not mention the questions of our day. It is of no consequence to us. Now, progressives tend to think what's in the past, what's old, is not that great, and that we should be evolving and are evolving, and what's coming next will be even better. They like to discard ideas from the past, and that quote should absolutely bring that home to you. The Declaration...
I actually, in a weird way, respect Woodrow Wilson. I think that's a terrible opinion. But I respect him that he's willing to say that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
For being I respect Wilson for being the first president to dislike the founding of the country.
I mean, he wasn't hiding it.
It does take some guts to do that. So now Wilson would later on say, he would go back and he would say, well, that first part, that's pretty, you got to take that out. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
But if you look at the Declaration, it talks about in the course of human events. Okay, human events are always unfolding. Whenever a government becomes despotic, governments are always becoming despotic. The Declaration it exists as something sort of aside and above history, something observing history and saying, look, these are problems that we need to solve. So let's just share a few quick things about Woodrow Wilson. Before he was president, when he was first starting out, he was hired as a professor at Bryn Mawr. According to Ronald Pistrito, who was writing for the Heritage Foundation, Wilson quickly became dissatisfied at Bryn Mawr. His salary was insufficient, and he regarded his position as less than prestigious because all of his students were women. So he wanted out of that.
Yeah.
He was always from a young age, he was fixated on government, the idea of constitutions, the idea of governing. He did not like the American separation of powers, which is what has actually protected the American system for hundreds of years. There's a reason that we have gridlock in D.C. There's supposed to be gridlock. That was the idea. It keeps things from getting done. And as long as Congress isn't doing something to you, they can't take your rights away from you. Wilson, however, should go down in infamy as the president who signed the national income tax law in 1913. Until then, an income tax was, in fact, it was unconstitutional. It was unheard of that the government would take from you because you work. The government could actually do that. That was unheard of. Wilson changed that. Wilson also brought back to life the Federal Reserve. allowing the elites to monkey with the economy and essentially tax us. Not only did he get the income tax, he established a system whereby inflation could be used to secretly tax us.
Yeah.
Yeah, while we're talking about Joe Biden comparisons, inflation was a huge issue of Wilson's
Yeah,
presidency.
yes.
So.
Sure took advantage of that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I could just print off money to pay for all this BS. That sounds great.
That's amazing. So let's see here. Another delightful little tidbit about Wilson. The eugenics movement was all the rage at that time. And if you don't know, the eugenics movement was the idea that you weed out undesirables from the gene pool. And of course, who was undesirable in that time? Well, it wasn't white folks. White folks were eminently desirable. Men, very desirable at that time.
Yeah.
So I'm quoting here from Paul Ray. He was writing in, I think this was in The Atlantic, if I remember correctly. With the dictates of social Darwinism and the eugenics movement in mind, in 1907, Wilson campaigned in Indiana for compulsory sterilization of criminals and the mentally retarded. And in 1911, while governor of New Jersey, he proudly signed into law just such a bill. Now, consider that overlaid with the criminal justice system that we see today and the statistics that were out there. Wilson would have been in favor of sterilizing untold numbers of black men.
Yeah. Oh.
That's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that that's very different from the current Democratic Party, which is that criminals should just be walking on the street free and you shouldn't be able to set bail and you should just be able to have people walking around.
Yeah, who could have guessed that racism existed in the party that founded the KKK, the party that supported, eugenics at Planned Parenthood, which was designed to basically stop the black population from growing, and guess what? They succeeded too.
They did. Yes, absolutely they did. The vast majority of babies aborted are black. That was the whole reason
by
Planned
design, Margaret
Parenthood.
Sanger,
Yep, exactly. That's what she wanted, to get rid of black people. And what you say is right. But it's also so predictable. The group that used race then to consolidate power now uses race to what? Consolidate power.
No, it's the same.
It's neo-racism now.
Yeah.
And it's not even, there's another piece to it. I don't know if you would call it quasi-neo-racism or what. It's what George W. Bush called the subtle racism of low expectations.
Yeah.
So this idea among the left that blacks simply can't do it. They're incapable of functioning in society without the help of the government, which should be such an unbelievably demeaning idea.
Yeah.
But even civil rights leaders have bought that hook, line, and sinker.
I mean, a clear example is the voter ID thing. A black person can't go get an ID. I mean, that's the implication that today's activists are making.
They infantilize, minorities. They pretend like, oh, you can't really do anything for yourself, so let us white people take care of you. We can take care of you. So it's the same, I think a lot of people get confused and they say, okay, well, they were racist back then and they're not racist now. No, that's not quite.
No.
That's not quite what it is. It's back then they used race, like you said, Josh, they used race as a means for attaining power. They still do that. They will always do that. It's always about power and it's always about manipulation to gain power. That's what the Democratic Party is. That's what leftists are.
And the reason it's changed, and that you guys know this for sure, the reason it's changed is that the left realized, by the 60s, the left had figured out, oh, wait a minute, America's finally over racism. They actually see how horrible racism was. And so the left immediately weaponized that and realized white people particularly are insanely sensitive to charges of racism. And so they realized, oh, well, gosh, I can get people to comply with whatever I want them to do if I'm a leftist just by saying, hey, Grant, sounds like you're a little bit racist, man. And then people just freak out wanting to prove that they're not. So Anyway, we were talking about civil rights leaders kind of buying this neo-racism. Well, back in Wilson's day, there was a civil rights leader who did not buy the racism that existed then, and he called Coolidge out. He called Wilson out on it, and it didn't end well. I want to read you a quick excerpt. This is from Dick Lair, who was writing in the Atlantic. I think I said Paul Ray was writing in the Atlantic earlier. He was writing for National Review. Anyway, Dick Lair over in the Atlantic, he writes about a spectacular episode in the Wilson White House where he actually threw a civil rights leader out of the Oval Office. Civil rights leader was William Monroe Trotter. So Trotter went to the White House to push back against some things that Wilson was doing, and this is how it went according to Lair. Trotter began with a reference to their 1913 meeting and to the petition he had presented containing 20,000 signatures from 38 states protesting against the segregation of employees in the national government. By the way, it should be noted, Jim Crow had essentially died by the 1890s. It came back when Wilson began bringing it back. It was
Makes
under
sense.
Wilson that the Postal Service was segregated. It was under Wilson that federal employee to apply for a federal job, you started to have to include a photograph. It was under Wilson that black people were pushed into the back behind screens so that they couldn't disturb other people. So anyway, Trotter saying, he listed the on-the-job race separation that had gone unchecked since at eating tables, dressing rooms, restrooms, lockers, and especially public toilets in government buildings. He then charged that the color line was drawn in the Treasury Department, in the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Navy, the Interior, the Marine Hospital, the War Department, and in the, if that weren't bad enough, in the sewing and printing divisions of the Government Printing Office. Trotter also noted the political support he and other civil rights activists had provided Wilson. Quote, only 2 years ago, you were heralded as perhaps the second Lincoln, and now the Afro-American leaders who supported you are hounded as false leaders and traitors to their race, Trotter said. And when he reminded the president of his pledge to assist, quote, colored fellow citizens in advancing the interest of their race in the United States, and he reminded him of that and then ended up posing a question that contained a jab at Wilson's much ballyhooed economic reform program. Have you a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for your Afro-American fellow citizens? God forbid. Quoting Dick Lair, the meeting quickly turned sour.
You know, I graduated college in 2019, and my leftist professor, they like to talk a lot about the racism of Trump and the racism of Ronald Reagan, apparently. But for some reason, they hate his guts at universities all over the country. But funny how, none of this ever came up.
Never.
It's like the most overt racism you could possibly imagine.
If, let's see, I'm trying to find my reference. If the claim, that's it. C. Van Woodward noted nearly 60 years ago, in the strange career of Jim Crow, it became the norm in the North only when it received sanction from the racist progressives in the North. It was on its way out in it was in the South. It was trying to infiltrate the North, and it did when the progressives got power.
Yeah.
Remember that, folks. Remember that. All right, that's it. Anything else?
Yeah, I have one more point actually about Woodrow Wilson, and I think it's pretty important. The idea of prohibition actually came under him as well. It started as a war thing in 1918, and then it continued, and we had prohibition that came about, and I believe it was 1920, 20-something, early 20s.
Yes.
And so, he's the worst president ever.
Why? Does anybody know why that movement picked up steam?
I mean, I know it started
answer.
during the war, but I don't know exactly.
The men were off fighting.
Yeah.
The men were off fighting. It's an interesting thing. Milton Friedman made that observation once. All right. Great point. That's it for us, folks. Happy President's Day. Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate it. We appreciate you all being involved in us, being involved in the fight for the American project and American ideals, this idea that we are created that we are created equal and that we are created in the image of God, and that there are certain rights that are unalienable. And I think you folks here realize those ideas are under siege dramatically. And they always have been. There will freedom, liberal democracy, which is what we have, is not the natural order of things. And things are always trying to revert to authoritarianism and chaos. What we've got right now is magical, and I think you watching understand that too. So thank you for fighting alongside us. Thank you for reading our articles at westernjournal.com. Thanks for watching the show. If you are watching the show on YouTube or Rumble, be sure to click the subscribe button. After you click that, a little bell will pop up. Click the bell. That'll make sure you get notified every time we go live. You won't miss an episode that way. Also, thank you for helping in the fight just by doing what you're doing. But if you feel led to support us in a more direct way, you can go to westernjournal.com/join. That's westernjournal.com/join. There's several ways there for you to support us directly and help directly fund the fight that we are in. As I've said many times, we're a small family-owned company. We're not big. We're it is great that there are huge conservative companies out there worth tens of millions of dollars. Wonderful. More power to them. That is not us. We do something unique that is niche. We are Christian first, conservative second, and we need your help to support the fight. Let's see here. I think that's it. Thanks for being with us on this Monday, this President's Day. For Grant, for Michael, for everybody back in the booth, I'm Josh Manning. We're going to see you Wednesday, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific.